The first thing I felt wasn't fear, though it was certainly lurking, a coiled serpent in the pit of my stomach. No, the first sensation was cold. Bitter, unforgiving cold that seeped into my bones from the polished marble beneath my skin. Naked. Entirely, shamefully naked. The air hung thick with the cloying sweetness of olive oil, a scent that would forever after trigger a wave of nausea and a phantom chill. This wasn't the Athens I dreamed of, the one from dusty scrolls and hushed classrooms. This was a labyrinth of shadows and hidden appetites, a gilded cage where beauty was a curse and innocence a fast-expiring currency. Above me, the distant murmur of voices, a cacophony of refined laughter and intellectual sparring. I imagined them there, the lauded figures of Athenian society, reclining on plush cushions, goblets of wine gleaming in the firelight. Socrates, perhaps, holding court, his pronouncements on virtue and justice hanging heavy in the air. Or perhaps the notorious Alcibiades, his beauty as sharp as his ambition, weaving tales of military prowess and political intrigue. These were the men who shaped the world, the architects of democracy, the champions of reason. And I, a boy barely on the cusp of manhood, was their plaything, an exquisite ornament awaiting its purpose. The irony was a jagged shard lodged in my throat. They spoke of freedom, of the inherent dignity of man, while I lay here, a living testament to their hypocrisy, bought and sold, oiled and posed, a blank canvas upon which they could project their desires, their fantasies, their darkest impulses. My master, Critias, a man of considerable wealth and influence, had paid a king's ransom for me at the slave market. 300 drachmas, enough to sustain a family for a year, all for the delicate curve of my jaw, the way the flickering torchlight danced in my eyes. Not for my strength, not for my skill, but for the ephemeral beauty that would inevitably fade, leaving me as worthless as a discarded amphora. A young woman, barely older than myself, entered the chamber, her movements hesitant, her gaze averted. She carried a basin of fresh water and a small vial of perfumed oil, her task a daily ritual of preparation for my eventual use. I knew her name was Lyra, but we spoke seldom, the shared weight of our predicament a silent barrier between us. She understood, perhaps better than I did, the brutal calculus of this world. Beauty was power, but it was a power wielded by others, a weapon turned against the very one who possessed it. Each drop of oil she applied, each gentle stroke of the towel, was a reminder of my utter lack of control, my descent into objecthood. Our human connection was irrelevant, an inconvenience in the smooth operation of this twisted charade. Above us, the symposium continued its revelry. A voice thick with wine declaimed verses from Homer, while another debated the ideal form of governance. Their lofty ideals seemed a cruel jest, a thin veneer of civilization masking the primal urges that simmered beneath. This wasn't the sanitized version of ancient Greece, the one from the history books, where democracy and philosophy reigned supreme. This was the Athens of shadows and secrets, where the lines between virtue and vice blurred in the flickering torchlight, where the powerful indulged their whims without consequence. This was the real Athens, built on the backs of slaves and the shattered dreams of the innocent. And tonight, I would become another casualty of its insatiable appetite. Critias's villa sprawled across a vast expanse of the city, a testament to his wealth and influence. Its marble courtyards were adorned with sculptures and mosaics, depicting scenes of mythological excess, the gods themselves engaged in acts of unrestrained passion and power. Each room whispered of decadence, each detail carefully curated to titillate and impress. But Critias was more than just a wealthy dilettante. He was a heterosakos, a purveyor of pleasure, a euphemism for something far more sinister. He managed a stable of beautiful young men, catering to the desires of Athens' elite, turning innocence into a commodity and trauma into entertainment. The symposium culture, that cornerstone of Athenian social life, provided the perfect breeding ground for such practices. These weren't isolated incidents, whispered rumors in darkened corners. This was a systemic abuse, woven into the very fabric of their society, sanctified by tradition and justified by philosophy. Plato himself, in his dialogues, spoke of the unique bond between older men and younger boys, a relationship elevated above mere physical lust, a path to spiritual enlightenment. This was the intellectual fig leaf that concealed the rot beneath, the justification for the systematic exploitation of vulnerable youth. The very men who preached justice and virtue were the architects of this elaborate charade. The preparations were meticulous, a daily ritual of grooming and conditioning. My skin was cleansed with imported perfumes, my body massaged with oils that cost more than a common citizen earned in a month. My hair was styled in elaborate curls, designed to emphasize my youthful features, to make me more appealing to the discerning eye. Even my diet was carefully controlled, the foods chosen not for their nutritional value, but for their effect on my skin and physique. It was all designed to amplify the illusion of a beautiful, perfect object. But the physical preparation was only a small part of it. The psychological conditioning was far more insidious, a subtle erosion of my will, a gradual dismantling of my sense of self. I was taught to anticipate the desires of free men, to read their unspoken cues, to respond to their subtle gestures. I learned which guests preferred submissive silence and which were aroused by a display of apparent resistance. I learned to disassociate during the worst moments, to float above my body, to maintain the illusion of willing participation. The older boys, hardened by experience, had taught me the unspoken rules of survival. Never show genuine emotion. It shattered the fantasy, or worse, it invited cruelty. Never form close attachments. Masters deliberately separated those who showed affection. Emotional bonds were a threat to their control. Never resist directly. Defiance was met with beatings, starvation, or sale to an even more sadistic master. Tonight's symposium was particularly grand. Critias had been preparing for weeks, importing exotic delicacies and rare wines, carefully selecting which boys would be presented to which guests. I had overheard whispers among the servants, rumors of special requests from certain attendees, men whose reputations for depravity preceded them like a shadow. The guest list read like a who's who of Athenian society. Alcibiades, the charismatic general, renowned for his military brilliance and his insatiable appetite for pleasure. Xenophon, the historian, whose writings would be studied for centuries, oblivious to the darkness that lurked within his soul. And of course, Critias himself, the philosopher-politician, a man who wrote eloquently about justice while profiting from the misery of others. They didn't see the contradiction, these men. They existed in a world where slaves, women, and foreigners occupied a different moral sphere. The virtues that governed their interactions with each other simply didn't apply to their treatment of those they considered inferior. They could be generous to their peers, just to their equals, and utterly cruel to their possessions, without any sense of dissonance. It was a moral code based on power and privilege, a code that allowed them to indulge their darkest desires with a clear conscience. As I lay there, waiting for the inevitable, I closed my eyes and tried to conjure a memory of my former life, a life before the slave market, before the cold marble and the oily sheen. But the memories were fading, like whispers in the wind, replaced by the sharp, unforgiving reality of my present existence. The door creaked open, and the torchlight spilled into the chamber. Critias entered first, his impeccable hematon draped in perfect folds, followed by tonight's guest, a man whose face was etched in my memory, a man whose touch I dreaded.
The guest tonight was Callicrates, a veteran of the Peloponnesian War. His hands, calloused and scarred, spoke of battles fought and victories won. But his eyes held a different kind of hunger, a predatory gleam that sent a shiver down my spine. He was a frequent visitor to Critias's villa, a connoisseur of beauty, a collector of flesh. He had a reputation for cruelty, a penchant for inflicting pain that left the other boys whispering his name in fear. Critias gestured towards me with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The boy has been prepared according to your specifications," he murmured, his voice as smooth as polished marble. "Fresh oils from Egypt, bathed in rosewater. Positioned as you requested. The evening's entertainment awaits your pleasure." Callicrates circled me slowly, his sandals clicking against the cold floor. Each step was a deliberate act, a calculated performance. He was savoring the moment, relishing the anticipation, enjoying the power he held over my trembling body. I remained perfectly still, my muscles locked in place, my mind a blank slate. I had learned to detach, to separate myself from the experience, to become an empty vessel waiting to be filled. He paused, his gaze lingering on my face, his eyes scrutinizing every detail. "Exquisite," he breathed, his voice a low, rasping whisper. "A true masterpiece. Critias, you have outdone yourself." Critias inclined his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Only the best for my esteemed guests," he replied. "I pride myself on providing the highest quality entertainment." Callicrates ran a finger along my oiled skin, his touch sending a jolt of revulsion through my body. "The Lydians believe that true wisdom comes through the corruption of innocence," he said, quoting some obscure philosophical text. "That the soul learns its deepest lessons when the body surrenders to experiences beyond its natural inclinations. Tonight, we shall test this theory thoroughly." His words were like a cold blade, twisting in my gut. This wasn't just about pleasure, about satisfying a base desire. This was about philosophy, about a twisted belief system that justified his actions, that elevated his depravity to the level of intellectual pursuit. He saw himself as a philosopher king, a seeker of truth, a benefactor bestowing wisdom through pain and degradation. The symposium continued above, the laughter and conversation a mocking counterpoint to the horror unfolding in the chamber. They were discussing the nature of love, while practicing its most corrupted form. They were debating the meaning of justice, while perpetuating systematic injustice. They were celebrating the achievements of their glorious democracy, while treating human beings like commodities to be consumed and discarded. Callicrates leaned closer, his breath hot on my neck. "Tell me," he whispered, "do you understand the significance of this moment? Do you realize that you are participating in a profound philosophical experiment?" I remained silent, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my mind adrift. I had learned that words were useless, that resistance was futile. My only defense was to disappear, to become invisible, to cease to exist. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Silence is golden," he murmured. "Perhaps your understanding runs deeper than I suspected." What followed was a blur of pain and humiliation, a slow, agonizing descent into oblivion. Callicrates was methodical, precise, his movements deliberate and calculated. He seemed to derive as much pleasure from the anticipation as he did from the act itself. He prolonged the experience, savoring every moment, relishing the power he held over my body and my spirit. He was a master of cruelty, a connoisseur of suffering. He punctuated his actions with philosophical pronouncements, quoting Heraclitus while inflicting pain, discussing the nature of justice while perpetuating injustice, waxing philosophical about the beauty of youth while systematically destroying it. The cognitive dissonance was almost comical if it weren't so utterly horrifying. These men, the pillars of Athenian society, the champions of reason and virtue, were monsters in the shadows, their carefully constructed facades crumbling under the weight of their own depravity. By dawn, I was a broken thing, discarded like a used amphora. I dragged myself back to the servant quarters, my body aching, my spirit shattered. The other boys, their faces pale and drawn, offered no words of comfort. They knew better than to speak of such things. Silence was the only refuge, the only way to preserve a shred of sanity in this world of madness. The morning brought news that the symposium had been a resounding success. Word spread through the elite circles of Athens about the quality of Critias's entertainment, generating a fresh wave of requests from wealthy citizens eager to sample his collection of beautiful boys. My reputation as a particularly compliant and aesthetically pleasing object had increased my value, a development that filled me with dread rather than pride. I was trapped, a prisoner in a gilded cage, my beauty my curse, my youth my downfall. There was no escape, no hope of rescue. I was destined to spend my days as a plaything for the rich and powerful, my body and spirit slowly consumed by their insatiable appetites. As I went through the motions of my daily routine, bathing in perfumed water, applying fragrant oils, styling my hair in elaborate curls, I felt a growing sense of despair. The emptiness inside me was expanding, threatening to swallow me whole. I was becoming a shell, a hollow imitation of a human being. I longed for oblivion, for the sweet release of death. But even that was denied to me. I was too valuable to be allowed to die. My purpose was to serve, to entertain, to provide pleasure to those who held the power of life and death over me. I was a commodity, a tool, an object to be used and discarded. And in this world of shadows and secrets, innocence was a luxury I could no longer afford. It was a price that demanded a soul payment that no one wanted to fulfill. I knew, deep down, that the only way to survive was to become like them, to embrace the darkness, to shed the last vestiges of my humanity. The cycle continued, day after day, night after night, the endless repetition of humiliation and degradation. I was losing myself, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but an empty husk, a beautiful mask concealing a void. I longed for oblivion, for the sweet release of death. But even that was denied to me. I was too valuable to be allowed to die. My purpose was to serve, to entertain, to provide pleasure to those who held the power of life and death over me. I was a commodity, a tool, an object to be used and discarded. And in this world of shadows and secrets, innocence was a luxury I could no longer afford. It was a price that demanded a soul payment that no one wanted to fulfill. I knew, deep down, that the only way to survive was to become like them, to embrace the darkness, to shed the last vestiges of my humanity. The cycle continued, day after day, night after night, the endless repetition of humiliation and degradation. I was losing myself, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but an empty husk, a beautiful mask concealing a void.
Sexual exploitation in ancient Greece did not only affect enslaved boys. Women, too, were subject to deeply entrenched systems of control and erasure. Athenian wives lived under strict confinement, regarded legally and socially as dependents. Their primary roles were domestic, to bear children, manage the household, and obey their husbands. Their desires, thoughts, and autonomy were systematically disregarded, as their lives were shaped entirely by patriarchal expectations. In stark contrast stood the Hetairai, educated courtesans who participated in elite male society. These women, often foreigners, were trained in rhetoric, music, and philosophy. They represented a rare form of female visibility and agency, able to engage intellectually and artistically with men. However, their freedom was always conditional and precarious. Their value is measured by their ability to please and serve powerful patrons. Independence, for them, was a curated illusion, subject to the whims of those who held authority over their survival. Certain religious festivals, such as the Dionysian rites, offered temporary suspension of societal norms. These ecstatic celebrations, framed as spiritual transformation, often included behaviors that today would raise deep ethical questions. But in their time, they served as legitimized outlets for the elite, cloaked in ritual to avoid criticism. The secrecy of these ceremonies reinforced existing hierarchies, allowing privilege to mask itself as piety. Other religious institutions, such as temple service for girls in certain regions, reflected how cultural practices could obscure exploitation behind layers of tradition.
Such rites were often described as sacred or preparatory, but they placed young individuals in roles that demanded emotional labor and personal sacrifice, all under the guise of religious devotion. Families participated in these systems, sometimes with pride, unaware of or resigned to the personal toll involved. Marriage customs further exposed the lack of female autonomy. Athenian girls were often married soon after puberty to older men chosen by their fathers. These arrangements were economic and political, not romantic, with no input from the bride herself. Rituals emphasized her new role in the household, marking her transition into a life of submission. Consent was irrelevant. Emotional maturity was not a concern. The girl's function was clear: to produce heirs and manage domestic affairs. I observed similar patterns of dehumanization in the household where I spent my youth. Over time, I watched new arrivals experience the same loss of self that I had endured. First confusion, then withdrawal, then a hollow compliance that became their new identity. Some broke under the weight. Others adopted, reshaping themselves to fit the mold expected by those in power. A few even became instruments of the system, perpetuating it as a means of survival. I survived by becoming what was required: agreeable, quiet, and emotionally distant. That distance kept part of me intact, but eventually, even that strategy wore thin. There came a point when pretending no longer protected me. It only prolonged the pain. The Athens of philosophers and poets, of democracy and beauty, masked a darker reality beneath its polished surface. Behind its marble columns and noble rhetoric lay a structure of exploitation so normalized that its victims were forgotten by history. The cultural triumphs of Greece were built not only by thinkers and artists, but also on the silent suffering of those who had no voice. Tonight, as sounds of celebration echoed above and footsteps approached my door once more, I tried to recall my mother's face, but time had stolen that image from me. Memory, like innocence, faded quietly in a society that confused greatness with virtue, one that built its ideals on foundations laid by those it was content to break. The oil on my skin shimmered faintly in the torchlight as the door creaked open, and I stepped once again into a role I never chose. Athens would call it tradition, civilization, even excellence. I no longer had a name for it.
The man standing in the doorway wasn't Callicrates. It was Alcibiades. His presence radiated power and charisma, a palpable force that filled the small chamber. He was younger than Callicrates, his beauty more striking, his eyes sharper, more calculating. He was a master of manipulation, a political chameleon, a military genius. He was also known for his voracious appetite for pleasure, his insatiable curiosity, his willingness to defy convention. He surveyed me with a detached air, as if I were a piece of art, a rare artifact to be admired and assessed. There was no hunger in his gaze, no predatory gleam. He seemed more interested in the game than in the conquest. "Critias," he said, his voice smooth and resonant, "you have surpassed yourself. This boy is exquisite." Critias bowed his head, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "He is one of my finest acquisitions, Alcibiades, a true gem." Alcibiades stepped closer, circling me slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "But is he more than just a pretty face?" he asked, his tone challenging. "Does he possess a mind, a spirit?" Critias chuckled. "A slave has no need for such things, Alcibiades. His purpose is to serve, to obey." Alcibiades stopped, his gaze piercing. "I disagree, Critias. Even a slave can possess a spark of intelligence, a flicker of defiance. It is our duty to find it, to nurture it." He reached out and touched my face, his fingers tracing the curve of my jaw, the line of my cheekbone. His touch was surprisingly gentle,
almost tender. "Tell me, boy," he said, his voice low and persuasive, "what is your name?" I hesitated, my mind racing. I had been trained to remain silent, to avoid drawing attention to myself. But something in Alcibiades' eyes, a hint of rebellion, a spark of curiosity, gave me courage. "Damon," I whispered. "Damon," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "A good name, a strong name. Tell me, Damon, what do you think of our symposium?" The question caught me off guard. It was a trap, surely. To criticize the symposium would be an act of insubordination, a transgression punishable by swift and brutal retribution. But to praise it would be a lie, a betrayal of my own suffering. I took a deep breath and chose my words carefully. "It is enlightening," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I learn much from the discussions." Alcibiades raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Enlightening?" he said. "Is that all? Do you not find it hypocritical? Do you not see the chasm between the ideals we espouse and the reality we create?" I remained silent, my heart pounding in my chest. He was testing me, pushing me to the edge. To answer honestly would be to risk everything. "I am merely a slave, Alcibiades," I said, my voice barely audible. "I have no right to question such things." Alcibiades smiled, a knowing, enigmatic smile. "Everyone has the right to question, Damon. Everyone has the right to think for themselves, even slaves." He turned to Critias, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Critias," he said, "I have a proposition for you. I would like to borrow Damon for the evening. I wish to engage him in a philosophical discussion." Critias looked surprised, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Of course, Alcibiades," he said. "As you wish." Alcibiades turned back to me, his eyes sparkling with intrigue. "Come, Damon," he said, "let us explore the true meaning of justice." He took my hand and led me out of the chamber, away from the cold marble and the oily sheen, towards the symposium above. As we walked, I felt a flicker of hope, a spark of defiance igniting within me. For the first time in years, I felt like more than just an object, more than just a slave. I felt like a human being with a mind, a spirit, and a voice that deserved to be heard. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to escape this beautiful hell, to reclaim my life, to find my freedom. I didn't know what the night held, but I knew that I was no longer alone. I had found an ally, a protector, a spark of hope in the darkness. And that, I realized, was enough to keep me going, enough to keep me fighting. The echoes of his words resounded within me. Everyone has the right to question, to think for themselves. And in that moment, on the threshold of the symposium, I began to question everything.